He was just a teenager, walking home from work, when a cop slammed him against a car for no reason, no crime, no apology. But here's the twist. Years later, that same kid became the police chief. And guess who walked into his office? If you think this sounds like a movie, it's not. It's a real story. And by the end, you'll believe in second chances and sweet justice. So before we dive in, hit that like button if you believe in standing up for what's right. And subscribe if you love powerful true stories. Hands on the hood. Now! The voice cut through the cool evening air like a blade. 17-year-old Marcus froze, heart pounding, gripping a can of soda he had just bought after finishing his shift at the local grocery store. He had taken the same route home, every evening for the past 2 years, never expecting that one day it would become the path that would change his life forever. A police cruiser had pulled up out of nowhere, tires screeching as it cut across the road and blocked his path. The door flung open, and out stepped Officer Dalton, tall, wide-shouldered, his eyes cold, his voice sharp, barking commands without any explanation. Marcus barely had time to process what was happening before he was spun around and shoved against the hood of the police car. "You match the description," Dalton growled, already snapping on the cuffs. Marcus stammered something. Maybe a protest, maybe a plea. But it didn't matter. There was no discussion, no questions, no humanity. Just cold metal around his wrists and the rough tug of hands that didn't care if they were wrong. His backpack was ripped open, its contents spilling onto the street. School books, a half-eaten sandwich, a notebook filled with dreams. People from the neighborhood gathered, some watching silently, some filming with their phones, others simply turning their backs and walking away, unwilling to get involved. Marcus stood there, humiliated, confused, and completely powerless. After what felt like an eternity, a voice crackled over the officer's radio. The suspect had already been found across town. Marcus wasn't the guy. Officer Dalton barely glanced at him before unlocking the cuffs with a grunt. "You're free to go," he muttered, avoiding eye contact, then slammed the door and peeled off down the street without another word. No apology, no explanation. Just the lingering sting of injustice in the eyes of the community burned into Marcus's memory. He walked the rest of the way home with trembling hands and a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush him. That night. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He didn't even speak to his mom about it until much later. He just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something much bigger than a bad cop. He realized, in that moment, that he wasn't just stopped, he was dismissed, judged, and discarded. But instead of letting that pain break him, Marcus made a decision that would redefine his future. He wasn't going to grow up angry. He wasn't going to become bitter. He was going to change the system that had failed him. He started by asking questions. Why did this happen to him? Could it have happened to anyone? Was this what police officers were trained to do? The more he learned, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one bad encounter. It was about a broken relationship between communities and the people who swore to protect them. At school, he shifted his focus. Teachers noticed. Instead of goofing around or just trying to get by, Marcus started diving deep into books about justice, law enforcement, civil rights, and leadership. He joined debate club, volunteered in community cleanups, and even organized student-led discussions about how to build trust between youth and police. He wasn't just trying to move on, he was trying to rise above, and the fire inside him only burned hotter. He told his mom one night over dinner, "I'm going to be a cop, and not just any cop. I want to be the one who changes how the badge is seen." She didn't laugh. She didn't hesitate. She just nodded, like she already knew this moment would come. After high school, Marcus went to college, majoring in criminal justice. He took extra courses in psychology and sociology to understand both the people who enforce laws and those who are affected by them. He interned with local reform groups, went on ride-alongs, listened to victims and veterans, and soaked in every experience. When it came time to join the police academy, Marcus stood out, not because he was the loudest or the toughest, but because he was the most committed. During training, some recruits mocked him, calling him chief as a joke, or Mr. Rules because he never cut corners. But when it came time for live scenarios, Marcus was always calm, precise, and respectful. He didn't see suspects. He saw stories. He didn't see threats. He saw people. He graduated at the top of his class. His first years on patrol weren't easy. He was sent to some of the toughest neighborhoods, often patrolling streets where people were more afraid of the cops than of crime itself. But Marcus did things differently. He talked to residents, remembered names, showed up at block parties, and bought ice cream for kids on hot days. He never forgot what it felt like to be treated like a threat for simply walking home. He promised himself he would never make someone else feel that way. And slowly, things changed. People started trusting him. His reports were cleaner, his record flawless. He was promoted, first to sergeant, then to lieutenant, then to captain. He trained young recruits and his sessions were packed. Everyone knew that Marcus was different. He wasn't just wearing the badge, he was redefining what it meant. Then, one rainy afternoon, Marcus was called to oversee a disciplinary hearing. An officer had been accused of profiling and rough treatment. Marcus entered the room, file in hand, only to stop dead in his tracks. Sitting on the other side of the table, grayer and older, was Officer Dalton, the same man who had cuffed him for no reason all those years ago. Their eyes met. The room went still. Dalton's face tightened. He recognized him. Marcus didn't flinch. He sat down and opened the file like it was just another case. Because it was. The evidence was clear. Dalton had overstepped. Again, after the hearing, Marcus asked to speak with Dalton privately. The old officer looked nervous. "I remember you," he said quietly. "Back then, I didn't know. I was just doing what I thought was protocol." Marcus looked at him, calm but firm. "You weren't just wrong," he said. "You were careless, and that moment shaped the rest of my life, but not in the way you think. It made me realize what the badge should mean, and what it should never be used for." Dalton was retired. Early, Marcus was promoted again, and then, not long after, history was made. Marcus was named chief of police, the youngest in the city's history. The headlines ran with the story, but they didn't capture the depth of what it meant. The same boy who was once slammed against a police car for matching a description was now in charge of protecting the entire city. Under his leadership, the department transformed. He introduced body cam accountability, community liaison programs, and new training focused on empathy, de-escalation, and communication. Crime went down, and public trust went up. He hosted monthly open forums where citizens could ask questions directly and get real answers. He started scholarship programs for young people interested in justice, and one day during a school visit, a fifth grader asked him, "Have you ever been scared of the police?" Marcus smiled gently and said, "Yes, but that's why I became one, so you don't have to be." And just like that, the full circle closed. The teenager who once walked home in fear now rode in the front seat of a patrol car, not to intimidate, but to inspire. He never sought revenge. He sought reform. He didn't become a cop to wear a gun. He became one to carry change. And, to this day, every time he walks into his office and sees the badge on his desk, he remembers that night, the soda, the cuffs, the pain, and he reminds himself why he started. Because some stories don't end with a headline. They begin with one. Most teenagers would have let the anger consume them, maybe even lose their way after experiencing what Marcus went through, humiliated, handcuffed, and dismissed for simply walking home. But Marcus wasn't most teenagers. Something inside him ignited that day, not just rage, but a quiet, powerful fire. He walked into his small apartment that night, sat down at the kitchen table, and told his mother, "One day, I'm going to change the way people like him wear that badge." His voice didn't shake, and his mother didn't doubt. She looked him in the eyes and said, "Then you better start today." And he did, but not in the way most would expect. He didn't scream into the void. He didn't turn to violence. Instead, Marcus turned inward. He started asking the kinds of questions that adults often avoid because the answers are too uncomfortable. Why did that officer feel so free to treat him like a criminal with no evidence? Why do some people fear the police more than they trust them. Can one person really change a system so deeply rooted in power and fear? At school, the shift in Marcus was visible, not loud, but unmistakable. He no longer just showed up. He engaged. He stayed after class, questioning his civics teacher about constitutional rights. He borrowed books from the library about law, enforcement history, police reform, civil rights leaders, and how policy is shaped. He read about broken windows policing, about systemic bias, about how one bad cop can poison an entire department's relationship with a community. His notebooks filled with underlined quotes and scribbled ideas. But he didn't just want knowledge, he wanted experience. So he started volunteering anywhere that would have him. Community centers, local nonprofits. He joined youth programs, focused on justice, helped organize food drives, and began mentoring younger students in his neighborhood. People began noticing that this quiet, intense teenager had something most adults lacked: purpose. One afternoon, when a guest speaker canceled at a school assembly, Marcus raised his hand and asked the principal if he could fill in. The staff hesitated. Marcus was only 18, but they gave him 5 minutes. He walked up to the mic, heart thumping, and told his story, not to gain sympathy but to spark a conversation. He spoke about that night, the handcuffs, the silence, and the feeling of being treated like a threat when he had done nothing wrong. He asked his classmates, "What if it had been you, or your little brother? How would you want the officer to treat you?" The gym went quiet. Teachers leaned forward. Students stared. And for the first time, Marcus realized his voice could move people. That night, he got an email from his school counselor connecting him with a local police reform panel looking for youth representatives. Marcus joined and quickly stood out, not because he was angry, but because he was thoughtful. He listened. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable in the best way. He challenged veteran officers not with hostility, but with insight. If a kid like me is seen as a suspect for walking home, how do you think that shapes how we grow up seeing the police? He wasn't attacking. He was revealing. By the time college application season arrived, Marcus knew exactly what he wanted: to study criminal justice, but also psychology and public policy. He wanted to understand the system from all angles: the laws, the minds of those who enforce them, and the decisions made by those in power. He got into a respected state university, and before stepping foot on campus, he made himself a promise. He wouldn't just learn about the system, he'd enter it, and he'd fix it from the inside out. College wasn't easy. He worked part-time, to support himself, sometimes juggling shifts and all-night study sessions. But the fire never dimmed. He joined campus organizations, led workshops on police accountability, and even wrote op-eds for the student paper about restoring community trust in law enforcement. He interned with city council members, helped draft proposals for youth police dialogue sessions, and shadowed officers during ride-alongs to see the pressures and challenges they faced. He didn't want to tear them down. He wanted to build something better. He began to see both sides: the fear in communities and the fear within officers who were poorly trained or operating under broken leadership. He started asking even tougher questions. What kind of training should officers receive? How do you reward empathy in a system built on authority? Why do police departments resist reform, and who benefits from that resistance? During his junior year, he attended a leadership conference where former police chiefs, attorneys, and policymakers gathered to discuss reform. Marcus stood up during a Q&A session and, with his usual calm force, asked, "If the only way to rise in law enforcement is by following the old rules, how do we ever create new ones?" The room went silent. One of the panelists, a retired police chief, later pulled him aside and said, "If you ever decide to put on the badge, do it. We need people like you wearing it." That moment cemented what he already knew. He wasn't going to fight from the sidelines. He was going to step directly into the system that had once pushed him to the pavement. But this time, he would walk in standing tall. He applied to the police academy before he even finished his final exams. And when asked why he wanted to become an officer, his answer was simple: because someone needs to show the next generation that the badge can mean something better. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a student. He was a force, a future reformer. And though the road ahead would be filled with resistance, setbacks, and hard decisions, he was already unstoppable. Not because he was fearless, but because he had turned fear into fuel. The system that once tried to break him would soon learn that Marcus wasn't just another recruit. He was a blueprint for what law enforcement should be. Marcus entered the police academy with a quiet intensity that set him apart from the very first day. Not because he barked the loudest or looked the toughest, but because he carried something deeper, a mission rooted in something personal, painful, and unshakable. Some of the recruits rolled their eyes behind his back. They nicknamed him Mr. Justice, the preacher, or even the professor, mocking the way he quoted laws, referenced court cases, and always asked why. Things were done a certain way, but Marcus didn't flinch. He knew ridicule was a small price to pay for the kind of change he intended to bring. When training days got brutal, long runs in the rain, exhausting drills, and simulated conflict scenarios that pushed others to their breaking points, Marcus stayed locked in, quietly motivating others, refusing to take shortcuts and demanding more from himself than any instructor ever could. He paid attention to the smallest details, not because he was trying to impress, but because he understood that in the real world, details could mean the difference between justice and injustice, between life and death. He refused to cut corners, even when others did. And when a senior trainee tried to intimidate a younger recruit during an exercise, Marcus stepped in, calmly, directly, and with the kind of authority that didn't come from a badge, but from a backbone. "We don't break people down to feel powerful," he said in front of the whole class. "We lift them up to become protectors." That moment rippled through the academy. Instructors began to notice. Recruits who once laughed at him now looked to him for guidance. And when graduation day came, Marcus stood at the front of the class, not just because he had the highest scores, but because he had earned the deepest respect. Top honors, commendation for leadership. The very same system that once handcuffed him now handed him a badge, and he didn't wear it for revenge. He wore it as a reminder. For the next 10 years, Marcus dove headfirst into the streets. He didn't ask for special assignments or try to stay behind a desk. He took every shift, accepted the late nights, the dangerous calls, the thankless duties, all of it. He wanted to know his city, corner to corner, not through reports, but through people. He walked foot patrols in neighborhoods other officers tried to avoid. He learned names, shook hands, and remembered faces. He bought snacks for kids hanging around on stoops and asked them about school. He spent his off days visiting schools, to speak to students about their rights and responsibilities, not as a lecture, but as a bridge. "I'm not here to scare you," he'd say. "I'm here to make sure you know, because knowledge is power." At every traffic stop, no matter how routine or heated, Marcus treated people like they mattered. He didn't let a badge erase his humanity. If someone mouthed off, he listened. If someone was scared, he spoke gently. If someone needed to be arrested, he still offered them dignity. That approach didn't make him soft. It made him strong in a way that others couldn't fake. And slowly, it started to show. Residents began asking for Marcus by name. Community leaders mentioned him in meetings. Even hardened officers, the kind who scoffed at community policing, started pulling him aside to say, "Hey, how did you calm that guy down? Teach me that." Promotions came not because he asked, but because he earned. First to detective, then to sergeant, then lieutenant. Each step, he brought his values with him, and he didn't forget the weight of where he came from. As a supervisor, he mentored younger officers with the kind of compassion he had once needed. He challenged the department to rethink what it rewarded. "We can't just praise the number of arrests," he argued in a meeting. "Let's also reward the number of conflicts resolved without force. Let's value restraint as much as response." That bold thinking didn't always sit well with the old guard. Some called him too idealistic, but it was hard to argue with his results. In his precinct, complaints against officers dropped. Community cooperation went up. Crime went down. And inside the department, more and more officers wanted to train under Marcus. They said he made them not only better cops, but better men and women. He wasn't just leading. He was reshaping the culture from the inside. Still, Marcus never got comfortable. He carried a notebook with him everywhere, jotting down thoughts between calls, observations about what worked, what didn't, and how the system could evolve. He was always learning, always listening. And then, one rainy Thursday, something happened that no one saw coming. The city's police chief, a hard-nosed veteran with 30 years of experience, was suddenly forced to resign after a scandal. A secret investigation revealed years of misconduct swept under the rug, and overnight the department was thrust into chaos. The mayor needed someone to step up, someone who could restore public trust fast. Every name floated by the committee came with baggage, except one, Marcus, young, principled, unshakably focused. A long shot, some said. Too new, too community-driven, not political enough. But others argued that was exactly what the city needed. A new face, a new standard, a new direction. The mayor called him in, asked him if he was ready to lead. Marcus didn't blink. "I've been ready since the day a badge was used to humiliate me. I've been preparing ever since." And with that, he accepted the offer. The department, and the entire city, was about to witness what real leadership looked like. Not someone who played by the old rules. On a cold, rainy evening thick with the kind of tension that hangs in the air before something important happens, Marcus, now a well-respected captain in the city's police department, found himself walking down a narrow corridor toward a conference room where disciplinary hearings were held. It had been a long day, budget meetings, training protocols, interviews, but this case was different. A serious allegation had been brought forward involving a veteran officer, and due to the sensitivity of the matter, Marcus had been asked to personally oversee the review. The officer was accused of stopping and aggressively searching a young teen without cause. As Marcus entered the room, his eyes scanned the small table where the accused was already seated, and then he stopped cold. Sitting there, gray creeping into his once dark hair, was Officer Dalton, the same man who so many years ago had slammed Marcus onto a hood, cuffed him, and left him broken and furious on the side of the road without so much as an apology. The same man who had looked through Marcus like he wasn't human. For a moment, the room felt frozen. Dalton looked up, confused by Marcus's hesitation. And then his face changed. Recognition dawned like a thunderclap. The blood drained. From his face, his posture shifted and he instinctively straightened up in his chair. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't let emotion leak through. Instead, he calmly took his seat, opened the file in front of him, and began to read through the report. It was eerily familiar. The teenage boy had been walking home from basketball practice when Dalton, citing a vague, suspicious behavior, stopped him, searched him, and left him shaken and humiliated. No evidence, no reason, just a power trip, just like before. The rest of the room, made up of fellow captains and internal affairs officers, stayed quiet. Everyone could feel the electricity in the air. No one dared interrupt. When the hearing ended, procedure dictated that Marcus, as captain, could choose whether or not to speak privately with the officer involved. Most didn't, but Marcus stood and said firmly, "I'd like a moment alone." The others nodded and filed out. Now it was just the two of them, the boy and the badge, all grown up. Marcus stood for a long moment, looking at the man who had once made him feel like nothing. Dalton couldn't meet his eyes. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Do you remember me?" His voice was steady, not angry, but unshakably clear. Dalton shifted uncomfortably, still staring at the table. "I do," he said, almost in a whisper. "I remember. I was wrong back then, and I've made a lot of mistakes since." The room was silent except for the ticking of a wall clock and the distant hum of rain outside. Marcus nodded slowly. "You were wrong," he said. "But this isn't just about you and me. It's about every kid who sees the badge and feels fear instead of safety. It's about trust and how easily it gets broken." Dalton finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot, guilt etched into the lines of his face. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. Marcus stepped closer, not out of intimidation, but clarity. You don't need to say anything. You just need to understand something. I stayed in this system not to punish you, not to fight you, but to make sure no one else goes through what I did. That was the last conversation they ever had. Dalton was placed on administrative leave and quietly encouraged into early retirement within the month. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Something Marcus had fought years to bring to a department that once refused to see him. A few months later, word began to spread that the mayor had nominated Marcus for an even higher position, chief of police. There were whispers in every office, from city hall to local precincts. Is it really happening? The kid they once cuffed? Now he's in charge. The announcement came on a bright morning, with cameras flashing and reporters crowding the steps of City Hall. As Marcus took the podium, he didn't talk about titles or rank. He told a story, not in anger, but in purpose. He spoke about trust, transformation, and how systems don't change when you burn them down, but when you rebuild them from the inside, brick by brick. He didn't mention Dalton's name. He didn't need to. The lesson was clear. A boy once silenced had found his voice. A young man once pushed to the curb had claimed a seat at the table. The system that once tried to break him now wore his fingerprints, and it was stronger, better, and more just because of it. At just 39, Marcus made history by becoming the youngest police chief the city had ever appointed, a milestone that sent shockwaves through the ranks and ripples through the streets he once walked as a frightened teenager. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very corners where he'd once been stopped, questioned, and humiliated without cause were now patrolled under policies he personally wrote, by officers he personally trained. But Marcus didn't wear the uniform like armor, and he didn't sit in his office as if it were a throne. He wore it like a promise, and he used his position like a tool, always remembering that leadership wasn't about having the loudest voice or the highest rank, but about doing the quiet, consistent work of rebuilding trust. One conversation, one policy, one human interaction at a time. From the moment he took office, Marcus broke with tradition. No flashy press conferences, no tough-on-crime slogans. Instead, he walked straight into communities, held town halls in school gyms and community centers, and invited people, real people, not filtered voices, to tell him exactly what they thought, felt, feared, and hoped for. He listened without defensiveness. When mothers talked about their sons being scared to walk home at night, he nodded, because he remembered that fear. When young men challenged him, accused him of being just another cop in a suit, he didn't argue. He invited them to join advisory boards, to sit in meetings, to be part of the very system they distrusted. He created programs that were unheard of in neighboring cities. Officers assigned to local schools, not as guards, but as mentors. Every cadet had to complete community trust training before even putting on a badge. Officers were required to volunteer in the neighborhoods. They served to be seen not just as enforcers, but as neighbors. He launched a Walk With Me initiative, where residents could walk beats alongside officers and share what safety meant to them, not just what the department decided. Slowly but surely, the fear began to fade. People who once avoided police, cars now waved when they passed. Kids who had learned to cross the street when they saw a uniform began running up to offer high fives. And still, Marcus stayed humble, walking through the city quietly, wearing his badge low and his empathy high. One afternoon at a community picnic in the park, a young boy, maybe 8 years old, full of curiosity, tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Sir," the boy asked shyly, "were you ever scared of the police?" Marcus crouched down to meet him eye to eye and smiled, not with sadness, but with hope. "Yes," he said simply. "I was scared, really scared. But now, I work every single day so kids like you don't have to be." The boy smiled back, and in that moment, Marcus saw a reflection of himself. Not just who he had been, but who he had become. His story began spreading far beyond the city limits. Journalists wrote about the chief who turned trauma into transformation. Students asked to interview him for school projects. Law schools used his journey as a case study in ethical leadership, but Marcus never let the attention distract him. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing healing. He reinstated programs focused on mental health for officers, recognizing that strong communities start with strong, emotionally healthy protectors. He reformed the complaint system to ensure transparency, and every few months, he still walked the streets alone, no escort, no cameras, to stay grounded in the place that had shaped him. And through it all, he never forgot that moment, decades earlier, when he stood with his hands on the hood of a car, humiliated and helpless. That moment didn't break him. It became the foundation of everything he built. One night, sitting alone in his office long after the city had gone quiet, he looked at a faded photo he kept in his desk drawer. A photo of his 17-year-old self, backpack torn, eyes wide with shock. He whispered quietly, "You made it." And it was true. Not just because he now held power, but because he used it with restraint, purpose, and compassion. In a world obsessed with revenge, Marcus chose redemption. In a system that once ignored his pain, he created policies that valued listening. And in a culture where power so often corrupts, he proved that real strength is found not in the ability to command fear, but in the willingness to earn trust. People began to say that Marcus didn't just change the department, he changed what people expected from it. Officers began carrying themselves differently, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. New recruits joined because they were inspired by the story of the chief who had been broken by the system and then rebuilt it. And slowly, across the city, the air began to feel different, safer, lighter, more hopeful. For the first time in decades, people didn't just fear crime or corruption, they believed in change. And behind all of it stood one man, not perfect, not untouchable, but honest, consistent, and quietly powerful. Marcus knew there would always be setbacks, challenges, and critics, but he also knew something deeper, that one man's decision to stand up, speak out, and stay in the fight could ripple out in ways no one could predict. And the boy who was once told to put his hands on the hood, he now sat behind the chief's desk, not with vengeance in his heart, but with justice in his hands, making sure that no child in his city would ever be made to feel small again. So, what do we learn from Marcus's story? That sometimes, the very system that breaks you can also be the one you rise to change. He didn't seek revenge. He chose redemption. He didn't run away from what hurt him. He ran through it and came out stronger. Marcus proved that real power doesn't come from a badge or a title or fear. It comes from how you treat people when no one's watching, and maybe, just maybe, the most powerful kind of justice is the one that leads with understanding, not control. If this story inspired you even a little, hit that like button so more people can hear it. And if you want more real-life stories of redemption, transformation, and courage, subscribe now, because the next story might just be the one you need to hear. Thanks for watching. And remember, every scar has a story, and every story can lead to change.